Okay, we're here with Professor Rafael Corredia. Is that correct?
Yes.
Help me out.
Right.
It's close. Who's you're with the business school? Is that correct at University of Maryland?
Yes, at the Smith Business School at University of Maryland in College Park.
Yeah, and then you're on your way to another university. Is that correct?
Sorry?
But you will be next year. Will you be? Where will you be next year?
I'm moving to Ohio State.
Okay. And thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed today. We wanted to talk to you a bit about your research on where you're looking at the issue of government-funded patents. And
Mhm.
let's go to the professor, I think, right? I think we have the slide. So uh, uh, I thought what we do is you talked to me on Saturday about this issue of the disclosure that
Mhm.
people find on the patents about whether or not the federal government funds research or not. And I know that your own research has been examining that issue in the context of the significance of patents that the federal government has provided grants for. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your research and a little bit about the mechanics of how the disclosures are made for other people that want to look at other issues about federally funded research.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my work. My research is on innovation in the part of invention particularly, and I use patent data to track the evolution of technology. Um, Patent data gives a lot of information and it's very useful because really perhaps it's the best way to track how technology evolves and knowledge flows despite all the limitations that it has. Um, there has been improvements in the last 30 years on the quality of the patent data for the purpose of this type of research, right? What I'm doing now is looking at how, among other things, how the federal funding of research drives the evolution of technology. And I have developed a measure of influence that captures not just the direct effect of an invention on the future technology, but all the other things that pop up thanks to this invention and the indirect effects, the ripple effects of the innovation. So to measure the effect of the federal funding, what we started doing was using this declaration of government interests that are present in patents to identify which patents have received federal funding. Since Bayh-Dole, this has been mandatory, and there are very strict ways about how it should be done. Right? The declaration of government interest, there is a specific wording in the legislation that should be followed. They should give information about the agency. They should give information about the contract. The problem that we were very optimistic about this ability that this will provide to us, but we found that there are more problems than we expected. There are several ways to access this information. Right, one is through the USPTO website through the search. There's also a collaboration between Google and USPTO that had made the raw files available with all the information about patents and applications. And you would expect to find this declaration of interest there. What we have found is that there are several issues there. One is first, not all the patents that have received federal funding have declared that they have received the funding. Right? That's a first issue, and it has been studied, and there are papers that have shown an underreported reporting of about 30%, if I remember correctly. But that is not something that we are dealing with this now. Even in those that are reported, it's done in a way that is very difficult to process at a large scale. There's problem with the wording, so there's no standard way to extract the declaration of government interest from the raw data, that the raw files provided by USPTO and Google. There are two areas where they are declared. They are declared in the application, So you can go to the data set on application and get all the declarations of government interest, and that data set is mostly clean. In that data set, you have a good chance to find the declaration of government interest. If you go to the patent data, where you should find the same declaration of government interest, it is more difficult, because the way that these files have been developed, it's almost impossible to parse them in a way that you will capture all the information. So we have been struggling with this part, and basically the way to go around this, to find all the patents that have received federal funding, we went and got the information from the application data, from the application patents. So even if we are working with patents granted, we are getting the federal funding from the data set on applications. Other things that we were trying to do was to capture how much money, the productivity of the money invested in this by the federal government. That was even more difficult, because although the law requires people to declare which is the contract under which the patent was developed and which is the agency, we still find about 5% of the cases where the agency is, you cannot identify the agency from the information in the patent or the application. And with the contracts, it's even worse. We were able to connect about 60% of the patents with federal funding to a contract. And we used to do that, the data set of contracts, federal contracts from the National Archives. Despite all the attempts that we engaged, and we worked for several months trying to connect both, it was impossible. So the challenges that we are seeing here is that while Bay and Dole provides this hope of finding this connection between that will allow us to capture and measure the productivity of federal funding, because of the way that is reported, that today is still even impossible. We cannot connect the funding to the patents. We cannot even connect all the patents to the agencies that have funded. So those are the challenges, and we hope this can be solved. We think it's a very important aspect of this enterprise, that is the development of technology, and better information is necessary to really assess how the federal funding drives technology, or how much does it help. And today it's very difficult really to give an answer to that question.
I know that you provided some slides. Do you want to walk people through the slides that you sent us?
Yes, I just put together four slides where I want to show what are the challenges that I'm talking, and these slides, if you go to the first slide, okay, that is from the USPTO website.
Is this the right one? Are we in the right one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a slide. That slide is from the USPTO website, right? And in that patent search, you enter the number of a patent. There I have a patent. It's 6,387,539, I think. So the first page has a lot of information. You start going through pages, and I think this is in the fourth page. You see the statement where it says where the federal funding has been received by this patent is, and there's a contract number, and this was funded by the Department of Energy. Right? And this is very close to what the law requires in patents and applications. But this is from the patent, and this is basically a PDF of the original patent, right? If you move to the second slide, you're going to see that comes from Google Patents. Okay, you can go to Google Patents and get the same information through another page, right? And in this case, the declaration of interest shows up in the bottom of the information of the information about the patent, right? Sorry, no, I'm looking at the other slide. In the case of Google, it shows almost at the bottom of the first screen, right? If you look at the wording, they are similar to the original. If you go to the USPTO dataset search, not through images, but through a database that is similar to the one that Google uses, the declaration of government interest appears in a separate place that is clearly identified as government interest, and the sentence is put there. And that sentence shows almost at the end of the patent, right? So here you can see that there are 3 sources for the same patent, exactly the same information, and they come in different places. This is only one. When you start going through all the patents, then you have cases, for example, that they even say, instead of saying this was funded by a grant from the federal government, it says it may have been funded by a grant for the federal government. So I don't know what that means, right? So it is at a level of confusion that I think that this is very valuable, but we should have a standardized way to report the number, the contract number, the agencies, something like how citations are done, if we think that this is interesting. One of the problems that we have here is that the USPTO is not working for us, right? The USPTO is working to establish who has the priority, who has the claims over inventions. So this is something that was added to their work. And they actually are not very interested, or it's not something that they really, it's not in the main goal of the USPTO to report these kind of things. So while they have worked a lot on standardized things, and they do very well in citations or claims or things like that, in this type of things that were added to the patents with different purposes, they are not following through, and they don't have the interest and the motivation to do it. And so, and this is, if you think about it, this is a very complicated process, right? Who knows which is the contract number and which is the contract numbers? They have subcontracts. Different agencies have different ways of numbering contracts. So that involves a huge, perhaps a huge revolve of the whole process at funding and identifying contracts. In order to be able to do this. It's clear for me that the legislators, when they decided this, what they wanted to do is to track the money to the inventions, right? Unfortunately, today we can't do that still. Perhaps we need some standardization that I don't think is a huge process or very difficult, but it will demand certain efforts to achieve. And in the 4th slide that I have there, that comes from the EI-Edison, which is it's a program, a government program that where all the inventors that use federal funding have to report and provide their information of the patents that were generated through grants to the different agencies. Okay, supposedly this covers about 25 different agencies, federal agencies, that provide grants. What I have there is the explanation of the process. That is from the portal at NIH. The NIH perhaps is the best portal on EI-Edison. But even there, the information is not readily available. A lot of that, for privacy concerns and competitive reasons, they don't share that information. NIH some time ago provided a report on patents and federal funding. We found in that data set from NIH that we were able to identify, connect something like 60 to 80% of the patents in that EI-Edison data set. We found them in the of the patents that we found through the patent application data. that have received funding from NIH, only 60% of them have shown up in this iEdison. The other one who has some information like this available is the Department of Energy. And there is something like 100 patents only. We have talked to agencies, and NIH was kind of trying to help, but they couldn't do much. DOE were also trying to help, but that was basically what they could do was give us the things that were online. NSF doesn't keep a record of granting and the outcome of the grants that they have provided. Other agencies don't even answer, right? They don't even have a phone where you can call when you're looking for information of where their grants have gone and what patents have been developed. So there's still a lot of work to do. I think that Bay and Doyle has provided a framework to really manage these issues, but there's a lot of work that is still needed to implement this in a way that probably will be the ideal that the legislature had at the time of passing this law.
Well, if we could just stop here for a second, I'd like to ask if any of the people who are listening so far have any questions for you about this issue.
Just ask a question.
Go ahead.
My question would be, is this typical of the U.S.? Do you find that there's a difference in the way the European Patent Office actually describe if there's government-funded work? Or is it global, what you're describing?
I am not that familiar with the European system, but the system I'm most familiar is the USPTO. I think that these are issues that are intrinsic to the task that we are trying to map, right? When you start, you have a patent, you invest on a project, the project becomes a patent, then somebody has to go back years, 2, 3, 4 years later, and report the information. The lack of consistency and standardization in the numbers of contracts, that is an issue. The issue of having that they have subcontracts inside each agency, that is an issue very difficult to resolve, right? The standardization of the names, even with the patents. Just when you look at the patent and you have an assignee and it has a name, just it took until 2007 to really develop a good identification of the assignees, because there are typos when they write the name, right? It's a lawyer who writes the name. It's a lawyer who writes the contracts. It's a lawyer who writes the agency. And it's not the lawyer who was part of the contract. It's not the lawyer who is really connected to the agent. Information about inventors. Inventors, they have the location, right? When inventors is reported in a patent, it says where the inventor lives. That is not even very reliable either, because it's information that is passed through many people until it reaches the patent, right? So intrinsically, this is a very difficult task, right? I'm not familiar with I don't know anything like this in the European system of patents. They may have an identification of government interest, but I haven't seen it. So I haven't seen it on papers either. There may be some papers done in Europe that I'm not familiar with, but it's not something that is there and everybody's using. So I guess in Europe it's pretty much in the same situation as here.
And is there, did you kind of design a template where they would have the information that you need for your research? Like, is there a...
Well, what we are doing is working with RAs and a lot of computer power, running algorithms to trying to match the names and the contracts, and then when they are close enough, trying to figure out if they are the same or not. And with that, we have been developing a data set, but still is incomplete.
Maybe we should maybe we should consider having a discussion at the Standing Committee on Patents at WIPO to think about some standards or some suggested best practices in this area.
Yeah, I think that it is that part is needed, and it's not so only the problem with the patent, because I think the problem is also on the side of the grants, right? Because this archive from that we got from the National Archives, it is very confusing, it's very long, and it also has, it doesn't have the standardization, right? Things change depending on agencies. They have contracts, they have grants, they have contracts, they have different things that the same money has at least two numbers, right? So which is the number that the lawyer will pick up and include in the patent, right? And these two numbers don't show on every data set, right? They are in different data sets. So some are connected, some are not. Some are connected in one data set, some is connected in another. So it is really something that it should be, there is room for improvement, and that would help us to really track the productivity of federal funding.
Yeah.
Well,
there is one thing that I forgot to mention. The USPTO is working, and it should be releasing these days, a data set with the declaration of government interest for all the patents, I think starting from 2005. This problem of how difficult it is to parse the raw data that they give us to find the declaration of government interest is being addressed by the USPTO for patents, I think, starting in 2005. And if it's not already available, it will be very soon. They will release a data set with that collection, patent and declaration of government interest.
Do you know if they'll make an announcement when they publish it, or just kind of it'll be available sometime, we have to go find it?
Well, my RA has been talking with the people at the USPTO working on this, and he's the one passing me the information. I don't know how they are going to release it. If I can look for the information, who's the person who has my contact there at USPTO, and I can pass that to you.
I just want to check with you on, you showed us the PDF of the patent, the Google database of the patent, and then the full text search off the USPTO patent thing.
Yes.
The field in the third one on the full text search of the database, that's one that we typically use.
Yes.
And we find it fairly easy to identify hits off that because we search just to see if that field exists. And so how complete are we if identifying patents that have had some type of federal research by using the full text, the third one, the full text search, and just searching for that field? Do you think that's getting all the patents for which the disclosures have been made, or is it getting some smaller subset?
From what I heard, I haven't done this research, but it's probably 30% of the patents are not that do not declare government interest. There are issues about when they should declare it, because the law gives certain conditions that have to be fulfilled, and it's not a clear cut. So some people may say, yes, in this case it should be, or in this case it should not be. But even in cases that they are clear, probably 20% of the patents that receive federal funding do not declare that.
And what is
and going back to your question about using this, if you need for one patent, right? If you're looking for one patent, you go there and you will find it. And any of these three will work. The problem is when you're looking to find all the patents that have received federal funding among all the patents. Okay, when you have thousands, when it's going to look, it becomes impossible. When you have to resort to algorithms to go through the databases to find it, right? And that is where you don't find it. That is where the patents data set is not good enough to find it. The application data set, it is much better, but it started in 2001. The other aspect is that there are cases, and about in our search for patents between 2001 and 2004, about between 3 and 5% of the patents that say they received federal funding, we couldn't figure out from whom, right? There's no contract, and they don't even say the agency, right? So there is a group of patents that even when they declare, they don't give you the information who's the funder, who provides the funds, and under what contract. Okay? Then is the other issue that in many cases, it is not clear, even if it looks like not even the lawyers know if there was federal funding on that patent. So it kind of writes something that, in case they were, we are in compliance, but they don't report much. So and that is probably another 5%, right? And if you are talking about 10% of the cases that you cannot figure out, and add to that perhaps 20 or 30% of the cases that should be reported and are not, you're probably missing 30% of the patents that have been generated. There is one thing that doesn't, perhaps I found it interesting, but perhaps it's not that important. If you look at the declaration of government interest in applications, about almost 2% of the patents receive federal funding. And that's about the same number of patents that were granted. Okay? Of the granted patents, about 2% of the patents also receive federal funding. So it looks like the federal funding behaves as any other funding, if you think, right? It's not terribly bad. It doesn't improve the ability of a patent to be successful and become granted, but they are not funding patents that are worse than the others in general.
Oh, in terms of the validity, just the probability of going from an application to a granted patent, you mean?
Yes, from application to granted.
Now, when we look at the role of the government funding, we sometimes distinguish between patents that are granted to an American inventor versus patents granted to a foreign inventor. So it's about half the patents are assigned to a foreign entity. I think so sometimes the percentages look a little higher if you just look at the U.S. Inventors or the U.S. Or the U.S. assignees. And then another issue is we break it down by type. So if we look at diseases, for example, we find fairly significant differences in the amount of government-funded patents between disease types or between medical inventions and, say, other types of technologies.
Yes. Aside from this declaration of government interest, I have found serious differences by classes, right? If you look at the influence of a patent, patents in same classes have a certain level of influence, and they are very different for the influence of different patents. So the classes are very important, and in some cases going to subclasses, it's also very important. That goes with what you are saying of what type of research is methods or is drugs, for example. You can see the government is playing different roles, and in a paper that I'm working now that is looking at the federal government, we are finding that in general the government is filling a gap. The data so far is showing us that the government is not occupying the place that private funding would. They are going to places where private funding is not investing. That is where our preliminary analysis shows. And that in part goes agrees with what you are saying, I think. When you have the private sector investing heavily in R&D, then the government should behave differently from places where the private sector is not investing heavily, right? And when you're thinking about new drugs that will take 20 years to go on the market, private sector is not very interested in that, right? They want to invest in something that in 5 years will be on the market. So you would expect that would be driven by the federal government. While if it is equipment or technology that can go quickly to the market, then the federal government, you would expect to be a smaller presence in those type of markets, right?
Yeah, I never really thought about that or thought about testing for that. We've generally just been kind of more basic, just trying to figure out how many drugs had the federal government played a role in subsidizing research, and patents are only one measure. For example, there was we just got a list of 850 cooperative research and development agreements from the NIH for mostly involving clinical trials and drug development from the period of 2005 to 2015, and many of those are not associated with patents at all. And most of the grants, for example, are there's not that many disclosures coming out of the grants. But I think this issue of you raise a lot of important issues. One is that for your sort of big data work, having some thought going to how the data is organized would be useful. And you say this is kind of like an afterthought for the patent officer. This isn't the main thing that they do. So they're sort of casual about how they present this data. That's one thing I hear you saying.
It's not casual. They try to do the best, but they don't see the use that we give to them, to that data. So they don't organize it in the way that we want. I have been in presentations by USPTO people, and they say, ask us, we will try, but remember, don't blame us. We are just granting patents, right? You want to do other things with this data. That's not what we do. So if you don't come and tell us, we are not going to figure it out. If you tell us, we will try to collaborate and help. They are actually, the USPTO is very receptive to this kind of things, right? This thing that they are developing, generating a good data set for patents after 2005 for government interest, they were doing that before I contact them, right? We contact them because we found the problem, and we talk to them, and they say, yes, we know this, we are working, and we will, in a year or so, we will have this done. It takes time. That is not easy. It's not easy when you are dealing with these large data sets to really modify them and get them right. But although it's not perfect, the USPTO is very receptive, and they are more than willing to help to improve. So that is a good thing about the USPTO.
Yeah, what I was just thinking is that maybe WIPO would be a good place to propose work on the expert committee in creating a database that would be useful to actually come up with evidence-based policy, because whether the USPTO people are receptive or not, they actually write policy that affects patent policy that affects a lot of people. And I would love to hear that it's based on real evidence. Sometimes we hear stuff about government funding drugs. Sometimes we hear that it's not funding by the feds. But basically, for what you say, we don't really know. Nobody really knows. I mean, we know for a small subset of patents since 2005, for example. But since they come up with patent policy and position on patents, I think it's pretty important to actually come up with maybe a better design of a database. No?
I think that's what inspired the USPTO, right? This Bailey and Doyle Bill, what was the motivation? If you look at it, the motivation is to really figure out how good is the federal funding in promoting innovation, right, or inventions.
Yeah.
So that is there. If you look, you can understand why these things have been passed into law, if that's the motivation. Still, the implementation is still not perfect, and I think that it should be something that should be tried. The thing is, this takes a very long time, right? Because assume that you fix this now, it will take many years to start to collect the data to start studying, right? But at least at some point you have to start.
Is legislation the only option in terms of getting things done? I mean, Jimmy mentioned best practices or maybe guidelines or kind of a template. Maybe that would actually be efficient. No?
Yeah, and I think it's not that difficult if you think about this, right? It happens. It will touch a lot all the agencies basically, right? Every agency given a grant, we have to follow some guidelines about how to number the grant and the contracts. But then we should be clear what we put in the patent, right? So it should be that it's like a maybe 10 pages of data, right? 10 pages to follow of rules how to name, how to qualify the grants.
Yeah, it's a cross-agency issue, so it's hard to that the Department of Energy or the Department of or PTO don't have a standard way of doing it. It's really mind-boggling. Since they give so much.
They have a standard, right?
Yeah.
They have, but they don't agree, and depends even sometimes inside the Department of Defense, they follow different rules to name contracts, right? How many letters do they put in the front, or how many letters at the end? How many where do they put the year? A lot of things. So and at the end it's a 20-digit number, right? And when they are going to pass that into the patent, they cut half of them.
Just in terms of what is it? What research question are you trying to answer with looking at these patents?
So, for example, if you want to see where does the federal money has most effect on the productivity of inventors, right? Should they put the money on equipment, right? Or should they put the money on a particular project, right? Should they build facilities, or should they provide money to grant to operate during a project, right? If you have the grant identified, then you can see each grant how many patents have affected, right? But today we can't, because if there goes money to buy some equipment to run tests, that would have an effect on many patents, right? But today we don't know what patents use that grant by using that equipment, right? So these kind of things could be studied. How the different agencies invest money, and which one has the most influence in the evolution of technology, for example, right? But if you cannot tell which grant was what amount of money was tied to each patent, the only thing that you know is that there was federal funding.
Okay, wow. Yes.
Does anyone else want to ask any questions before?
Yeah, I had just one quick question. If we could go back to the figure that you said, I think you said it was about 30% unreporting rate.
Yes, that comes from a paper I read some time ago.
Okay. So, do you remember what the paper said about how it was determined that there was insufficient reporting? Do you recall that?
They use I can go back and look for the paper. Sampath, I think it was one of the authors. It's a 2012 paper, I think. They used Sampath from Columbia University.
Yeah, right. We know him. Yeah. Okay.
They use data from iEdison. So they have information from the NIH what patents have received their funding. And then I'm trying to remember, but I don't. They triangulate data, right?
Hmm. I mean, for what we do, if the 30% of the unreported patents tends to come mostly out of the NIH, then I think that would be pretty important for us. But
don't quote me on that number, because it's a number that I have from a reading I did a couple of years ago.
I think I shared with you once before that some years ago when the Inspector General or I think it was Inspector General or whatever it was, or the kind of the auditing part of DHS, they audited Scripps Research Laboratory. They found out they were only disclosing federal funds in government grant and in patents about half as often as they should have, and Scripps had to remedy that. So that's the only other thing I've seen before, and it was some time ago. So I don't really see much evidence that there's much monitoring of this issue by anyone.
Look, it has to be something like him, an auditor, because for me it's almost impossible to test that. For me as a researcher, an academic researcher, I can't do that, because I don't know what patents, what grants, where the grants went, and how they were used. So I cannot tell if a patent received or not received the funding, right? It has to be somebody inside who is able to track where each patent or where the funding for a patent came from. That is a very difficult research to run. It's a research that I cannot run with the data that I have, right? I can do something if there is somebody, if an agency tells me these are the patents that we funded, and then I can go out and look at the patents if they declare that they were funded. But I cannot do both things, right? I cannot see if they declare and know if the patent should have declared. So that is a very difficult thing to do. I think that paper used information that NIH made public that through iEdison it should be available, but it's also self-reported, right? If you look at the fourth slide, there are all the steps that the inventors who received and the companies who received funding from the federal government have to follow and report to the agency that gave the money, but it's basically voluntary, and there's no enforcement, right? Nobody has been taken the patent away, the rights away for not following these procedures.
Have you found in your research that the federally funded inventions are, as you mentioned earlier, things that take place earlier in the product development phase, or are they the same? I mean, like you mentioned that speculation you had before. I mean, has your own research been able to identify or answer those questions?
Well, we found that the federal government funds almost everything, right? They fund research on almost every area. They are very influential in areas that are kind of dead. It's almost a case study, right? What I have here, but we were looking by classes, and one class had the federal funding in a particular group of classes had a very strong effect. So we went back and looked at the classes, and there were classes absolutely, well, first it was the miscellaneous class, right? It was the miscellaneous group, and that is when you put everything that you don't know what it is. So then we started looking at what is this miscellaneous group. And we started finding things that were not very exciting. construction, refrigeration, and these kind of things. And then it was it refrigeration? Why is that interesting? Why would that be influential? The research done in 2001, 2004, influential today. And then we got into the construction and the refrigeration, and it was construction of tanks and refrigeration of gases. And then we realized, well, this is, and then we see that reflected in all this effort to transport natural gas. Because you have to refrigerate the gas and put it in good containers to move it around the world in an efficient way. So a lot of the research, and we think that that's the connection that we found there. We have to go deeper, right? But that is part of what we are finding, is that there's research done a long time ago in areas that were not very exciting that were picked up later because there was an explosion on another area that needed that research. So it looks like the federal government is doing research in areas, funding research in areas that are not very sexy today. And some of them become very important as the technology evolves for other reasons.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered your question.
No, this is very good. I think. Is there any other questions that anyone wants to ask before we conclude this interview? I think Menno's asked several. Rafael, is there anything you'd like to add before we conclude this YouTube video?
No, I just thank you for this opportunity, and if you have more questions, I'm available. You know that.
Well, listen, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you about this, which is, I think, an important area that it's interesting to talk to people that are actually doing empirical research in the area and are wrestling with the data and the problems of dealing with data. And I think we'll come back to you on this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.